Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. On the program this week, as the migrant crisis continues, Democratic lawmakers visit the border and more questions arise about the conditions at facilities holding migrants. And we check in on the immigration laws being passed at the state level. But before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are, as always, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
Good. Let's start today with the ongoing migrant crisis at the southern border. Last month, a group of congressional Democrats visited various facilities holding migrants, many of whom were apprehended at the border after traveling through Mexico from Central America. And while that visit did highlight the dire conditions in many of these facilities, it also sparked an argument over the severity of the problem and who's responsible for it. Let's start here. What happened on the lawmakers' visit, and how has it impacted the debate over what's happening at the border right now?
So the Democratic visit was led by several Democratic lawmakers, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of the more progressive members who tweeted out some pictures they took around the facilities and what they saw in the facilities. It was the same week that a picture was published in an Associated Press story of a father and daughter who had died along the border. And I think the combination of these things generated a lot of outcry over the fact that migrant children and families with small children are being held in facilities that are clearly not appropriate for them, in conditions and for time periods that are a lot longer than they should be. The lawmakers blamed CBP, they blamed the president, they blamed DHS more broadly, and started calling for shutting down the camps, shutting down all of the detention spaces. This bled over into the legislative discussion over the border supplemental bill. The Senate version of that passed that did not have all of the constraints on the spending of the money that some of these progressive Democrats had wanted to see. And so several of them, including AOC and her comrades, voted against the final bill when it went through the House. But it set up, I think, a very serious and vocal dialogue in Congress over these places where people are being held and the conditions in which they're being held.
Yeah, because I think a lot of it, what was interesting about this is the fact that it was being live tweeted and that there was sort of a very instantaneous reaction to what was being done. There wasn't really a time to sit back and really process the news in a really coherent way. The fact that it was being done on Twitter, I think, only intensified what was being shown. And as a result, for instance, there was like this eruption about whether or not the migrants in some of these facilities were quote-unquote drinking out of toilets because CBP guards made them do that. And that was sort of tweeted out, and then there started an exchange in the back and forth about whether or not that was actually the case, whether or not that was the truth. And I think the fact that it's just so instantaneous, that I think that's what made it very different, because we had the debate about the supplemental and that kind of happened and occurred in Congress, but at a much slower and more deliberative pace compared to what we saw here. There was the Democratic debates, and that kind of touched on these issues. But once again, that was kind of over the course of an hour, and there was some analysis after the fact. But this was very much boom, 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 boom with Twitter, and I think that that's really what kind of pushed us a little bit and made it more intense.
So I guess a broader question, though, is does this trip do anything to change the dynamic around immigration reform? In other words, are we moving towards solutions to address this crisis, the problems that we've identified, or are we just stuck fighting out a political argument right now?
So I think one of the things that this trip did, and the instantaneous tweeting and the response, is that cumulative sense of outrage rose significantly to a fever pitch. And so now there is a broad-based sense of outrage over the conditions at the border. Now, whether or not that sense of outrage can turn into constructive policymaking and solutions-based policymaking is yet to be determined. This afternoon, as we're recording this, there's a hearing in the House Government and Oversight Committee on titled "Kids in Cages," the treatment of children at the border. That is sort of expounding on this as well. But unless these turn fairly quickly to what do you do about this, what changes do you make, exactly how do you solve this problem as migrants still arrive, I think that this sense of outrage is not helping us get to a place of solution. It's important because it draws attention to the urgency of this. And we've been talking, I think, for several months, we started calling it a crisis at the border when we knew that this was happening. Now it is definitely in the public consciousness. It is definitely out there. The sense of outrage about what's happening in the United States, in U.S. government facilities, is real. It's important, but now we need to sort of move towards solutions.
I think the sort of this intensity and the anger, though, has also obfuscated kind of what the crisis is, right? And I think right now there's the underlying crisis that there's a lot of individuals who've been showing up to the U.S.-Mexico border, and that the facilities and the infrastructure that we've had along the border just hasn't had the capacity to hold these individuals as they're being processed. I think that's kind of the base crisis that we're seeing, or at least one of the components of it. But I think a lot of the outrage from the fallout from these visits kind of have muddied the water a little bit, because it's sort of, they're trying to say that CBP and DHS were responsible for this. It doesn't really get us, though, down to like really the nitty gritty of what is actually happening, what is the actual problem, and then how do we solve it. It seems that it's just been sort of generating a lot of outrage. I don't think it's been generating a lot of clarity. And without clarity, how can you really have any, an effective discussion about policy proposals?
So what do those solutions look like? They've been elusive so far, but what would make a difference, and what is it going to take to have those measures adopted?
So I think we need to think about this, and I think we've talked about this here before, in a few different steps. Like, what's the immediate need right now at the border? Where clearly there's an immediate need for some other type of facility other than the existing infrastructure at the border to house people when they arrive at the border. The first people they encounter is Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection. Their facilities are definitely not met for this. So where else do you take them to do the initial necessary processing? Who are they? Get their identification. Where are they from? Do a medical triage for people who have medical conditions. And then what's the process that happens for them after that? And we don't have those facilities, and we need to look at those facilities. Some of the border supplemental is supposed to be going toward that. That takes a little bit of time. Is there other things that can be done in the immediate moment to improve the conditions under which the people are being held right now? And I think that's a question that needs to be answered in terms of CBP resources. Can CBP have other resources brought to bear? Can they accept donations and volunteers? We've been through this on Twitter as well. The law does not allow CBP to take private sector donations for things that should be covered under government appropriations. So people can't just show up with diapers and bottles and think that they're helping. Can the government fix that? Yes, they can fix that. So we need to think about, I think Cris is right, we need to think a little more clearly about this, look at what can be done immediate. And then we need to look at the entire system. That's a medium-term thing. That's our own system of processing people after they arrive. Everything from the asylum system and how it functions to where else do these people go in the United States. We need to talk about what we're doing with Mexico and how that's working. Is that working, and is it the right thing to do? And then ultimately, what's going on in those countries that's driving people to leave.
Yeah, because I think the way to be thinking about this is that our immigration system has always assumed that there's two types of humanitarian flows. There's refugees, those are people in another country who seek humanitarian protection but are resettled through the United States in conjunction with UNHCR. They're brought here through an organized process. And there's the individuals who arrive here seeking asylum. And one of the things I've been reflecting on over the last couple of weeks and even couple of months is the fact that large movements of asylum seekers were really never acknowledged in the way that we thought about managing our humanitarian system, even though this has been happening for 40 years, at least starting with the movement of Vietnamese coming, the Vietnamese refugee crisis, the Haitian crisis, and the Cuban crises in the 80s and 90s. Obviously, more recently with the unaccompanied child crisis in 2014, that there's these large movements. And yet our immigration system tries to sort of funnel this all through our asylum system without thinking more broadly, saying, what is a comprehensive way of dealing with mass movements of migrants many of them who are seeking humanitarian protection, some of them who might be economic migrants who are enjoying these flows. How do you handle that? And I think that takes a much bigger rethink than I think what we've been thinking about so far. So it's really going to be us, stepping out of our comfort zone and rethinking this as we move on and prepare for the next crisis, because there probably will be one.
So you guys have been putting forward an idea that you've been calling immigration FEMA, this idea of being able to flex resources to where they're needed, when they're needed. Can you explain a little bit more about what that concept is and how that might be helpful in solving the short-term problem?
So some of that is, if you look at how the U.S. government responds in the case of an earthquake or a hurricane or a significant flooding or some other natural disaster, the state asks the president for a national emergency declaration. That grants FEMA, the coordinating government body, the authority to coordinate across the federal government and with state and local governments to amass the necessary response to respond immediately to health and safety concerns, to mitigate the damage from the disaster, and then rebuild. And all of those things happen in sequence, and they happen under a structure that is well understood and well known by all the parties. FEMA has specific authorities to coordinate across the U.S. government to do this, including logistics and transportation that are available to them. They do temporary housing and food supplies, transportation, all of those things very, very, very well. And it seems to me that we need some similar capacity to deal with what's going on with migration at the border. Unfortunately, a migration event like this is not what's contemplated under our emergency statutes right now. So there isn't an equivalent of a national emergency declaration for this kind of thing that would bring all those same authorities to bear. I gave the example of CBP not being able to accept private sector donations of necessities for children in its care, for example. FEMA, on the other hand, when there's a national emergency, can accept donations of goods and services in response. So is there a way to extend those authorities to CBP to allow it to do that? But the biggest role, I think, is federal coordinated response and being able to pull in every level of government and non-governmental organizations. Like, can CBP accept the help of Doctors Without Borders to examine these people that are encountering? Actually, right now, no, they cannot. But FEMA could. And so, again, when I think about this, it seems to me that we need to think about this in a very different way than how we have been thinking about it for this immediate humanitarian emergency response.
And as a part of that is really kind of pushing DHS to begin preparing for these extraordinary migration events. They do a lot of exercises and forecasting of national disasters, even certain types of terrorist attacks that can level lots of infrastructure and have an impact on cities and communities. Why aren't we doing this for extraordinary migrations and events like this? I think there are telltale signs when you start seeing the emergence of this, that if you can look at it and just take it into account and then start saying we need to prepare accordingly, I think that that's really the other part. Because I think it's not to say that large movements of people are analogous to a natural disaster that levels communities. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that these are things that we could start forecasting and predicting, or at least starting to know and track and monitor to prepare for a capacity to be able to do this. So I think it's rethinking how we think about managing these events and preparing.
Yeah, and if you look back, when did this first start? Well, we first started noticing the unaccompanied children coming in 2014. They actually started coming a year or two earlier, but in large numbers, 2014. So we've been dealing with this now for well over 5 years, right? It has reached a peak now. But if we had additional resources and capabilities put to the forefront earlier, would we be at this point now? I think that's a valid question to ask. But in any case, we're dealing with right now clearly a humanitarian situation. That's what the visit of the Democrats to these facilities made clear. Some of them said it looked like a refugee camp or a disaster place someplace else. So I think we need to consider, how do we deal with the immediate humanitarian issues right now, and this is one way that we could look at doing that. Longer term, Cris is right. We need to think about, is our asylum system the best way to manage these flows? Do we need to think about that differently? And again, the ultimate solution is what's going on in those countries and what can we do to support those countries so that they can support their people.
All right, after the break, more on migrant holding facilities and the asylum process. The debate about conditions in facilities that hold migrants apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border has raised questions about how the United States keeps non-citizens in custody while they seek asylum. As Theresa has noted, the term immigration detention actually encompasses a complex network of facilities meant for holding different groups of migrants. These facilities are overseen by different government agencies, some of which are also responsible for transporting migrants between types of facilities as they move through the asylum process. So, Theresa, let's start with this. One of your pet peeves is seeing people use the term immigration detention to describe how the government keeps asylum seekers in custody. What's wrong?
So detention legally is a very specific form of custody, and it applies in the short term to Customs and Border Protection facilities, people who immediately arriving at the border. But more generally, it applies to the facilities that are operated or contracted by Immigration and Customs Enforcement for longer term holding. They are detention. They are civil detention, which means that they are not like criminal detention for the purposes of punishment. The purpose of immigration detention is supposed to be to ensure that migrants appear for their immigration court hearings and that they do not flee if they are ordered removed. That is the legal definition and purpose for immigration detention. As we all know, the immigration detention system, that part that's run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has expanded dramatically over the last 10 years, under at least two different administrations. And it now encompasses right now in custody close to 45,000 individuals in Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody right now in detention. But I want to step back and talk a little bit. The facilities that the Democrats visited were Customs and Border Protection facilities. And the types of facilities matter, and the term, how long people are held matters into understanding what we're talking about. So when somebody arrives at the border, whether it's between a port of entry or at a port of entry, they're encountering Customs and Border Protection. If they're at a port of entry, it's CBP officers. If they're between a port of entry, it's Border Patrol. At a port of entry at the land border has many, many lanes of traffic that enter, and places where CBP officers inspect cars and people, maybe has a little bit of processing space for, depending on the size of the port, anywhere from a dozen to 50 to maybe 100 individuals who need additional processing outside of the primary inspection lanes. They have offices for small interviews, and they may have one or two secure holding cells for people who arrive at a port of entry and maybe have an arrest warrant out for them, and so they need to be secure facilities. But most of the port of entry is meant for dealing with paperwork kinds of things. It is not meant as a holding facility for people for any length of time whatsoever. Under CBP rules, no one is supposed to maintain in CBP custody anywhere for more than 72 hours. This is especially true for children. But ports of entry are not designed for any sort of long-term detention or just people being there for any length of time. And so it's important to understand that. Most of them don't have any places for people to sleep. There's no separate dining area. There's no recreation. It's literally offices and holding cells. That's it. A Border Patrol station, which is where migrants encountered between the ports of entry along the border are taken, looks very much like a police station. It has various holding cells that can hold anywhere from a dozen to maybe 20 people per cell at max. It may have cement or metal benches in it. It usually does have a toilet or a water facility all the cells have visibility so that the CBP, the Border Patrol officers can see into them to make sure that the migrants who are being held there are not engaging in anything they're not supposed to. They can keep an eye on them. They are refrigerated. So a refrigerated room that is made of cement or metal will feel very cold to somebody who has just trekked days, maybe weeks, in very extreme heat and humidity, may have crossed the river and be wet. So they tend to be called ice boxes or hieleras in Spanish by the migrants. And that has been a long-term complaint that migrants have. The migrants are, again, not supposed to be held in these facilities for more than 72 hours. And so they may be fed while they're there. Again, they were designed when the majority of people apprehended were Mexican adult males who could be processed very quickly and were returned across the border, sometimes as quickly as 5 hours after they were caught, right? So none of these facilities were meant, certainly for families, certainly for children, or for long-term detention. The next step in the process for somebody asking for asylum would be, if it's an unaccompanied child, to be placed in a shelter that is operated by Health and Human Services. So HHS's Office of Refugee Resettlement is charged with the care of unaccompanied minors who are encountered at the border. So CBP relies on them to tell them when they have a space available for the minors they have in custody. And when I say space available, it's not just any space in any shelter. Some shelters are for teens, some shelters are for younger, tender-aged children, some are close to where they're apprehended, some are very far away and require more logistics and transportation to move them. If a child is sick in CBP custody, they may not be transported to HHS right away because HHS wants a medical clearance. So there's all kinds of logistics things that go into this, and whether HHS has facilities to be able to hold people. And if HHS doesn't have an opening right away, or they have an opening but they can't get transportation for that child to get there, then they stay longer than they should in CBP facilities as more people are coming in. So you have an input-output problem there. The other agency, ICE, takes families from CBP custody and also single adults. Increasingly, ICE has not had sufficient space for families, and because of legal limitations, cannot hold families in its detention for more than 20 days. So ICE has basically started shutting down some of its family facilities and allowing CBP to release families directly from its custody while trying to maintain spaces for adult males or adult females who are single and encountered to go to detention. Again, it depends on where CBP can send people in its custody to ICE detention, depends on what facilities are available. ICE facilities, even family facilities, primarily were designed for female-headed families, a female and children. Increasingly now they're encountering men with children, and the facilities were not designed to commingle that population with other populations. If you have a mother and a father with children, a family center that can accommodate that. So it's not just about is there a bed, is it a bed appropriate for the population that needs to move to it? And again, transportation issues and where you send them. So what I'm describing here, I hope you understand, is a complicated system that involves facilities, it involves the type of facility, who can be moved to what facility, the transportation networks to get them there, all of which is completely broken down as the volume of incoming people has exceeded the ability of all of these agencies to move them out of CBP facilities. And that's one of the reasons for the conditions that people are seeing at the CBP facilities.
So how well are all these various agencies, this network of groups involved in taking care of these folks, how are they communicating with each other?
So traditionally, all this process before this current situation was handled very locally. The local CBP and Border Patrol sectors had connections with the local ICE office that did the transportation and maybe the local HHS facilities, and they were able to coordinate locally fairly well. As this issue grew and grew beyond South Texas to other parts of the border, the agencies had not developed, I'd say, a nationwide look at all of this movement of people. And so they were developing that on the fly. They now do have a system that allows them to sort of understand where people are throughout the system at any given time. But I'd say it's still not like state-of-the-art coordination across all these agencies to coordinate. And there tends to be a lot of finger-pointing. If you look in the media, CBP will say HHS doesn't have its facilities or ICE doesn't have its transport, and ICE will say it's not us, it's somebody else. So there clearly needs to be a better set of coordination amongst all of this. And there doesn't seem to be a person whose job it is to coordinate among all of these agencies, this entire system, and direct who is doing what and who will go where. And that's a very important missing piece. If you don't have somebody who's in charge of overseeing all of the logistics, it's hard to understand how you can have a system that is functional when it's taxed to this level.
All right, when we come back, a look at what states have been doing on immigration policy this year. Let's wrap up this week with another look at what's been happening at the state level on immigration. Over the first half of 2019, some states have passed laws expanding benefits for immigrants, like the New York DREAM Act, which offers undocumented students access to state financial aid and scholarships for higher education within the state. And some states have passed more restrictive legislation, like Florida Senate Bill 168, which outlaws sanctuary cities within Florida. Cris, you're closely tracking all of these questions. So what have been some of the other major immigration laws enacted in states this year?
Yeah, so what you listed are obviously two of the major banners of state immigration laws that have been passed this year. The New York DREAM Act has really been one of those things that immigration advocates have been pushing for. It's part of a broader push from advocates to have what they call tuition equity, giving opportunities to undocumented students, particularly dreamers, the opportunity to be able to go to college either for in-state tuition rates that other individuals would have, other students would have, or to be able to get financial aid to be able to attend college. So the New York DREAM Act, which has been more or less in the works for a very long time, really was a major victory for them. New York also passed a law that actually gave undocumented immigrants access to driver's licenses. This was also another part of a major push by immigration advocates to kind of push the state to be more active. And I think it's actually interesting to see this happening of New York. I wrote a report on state immigration laws last year, and New York really hasn't been one of those states that's been very active in this space at all, largely because it's had sort of a divided legislature that leans a little bit more conservative than you would expect. So those are sort of two things that New York has done. But at the same time, you have seen states kind of maybe lean a little bit more conservatively. Florida, SB 168, does outlaw or at least prohibit the existence of sanctuary cities and does definitely promote closer work with federal immigration enforcement and state and local enforcement. The ironic thing is that there really hasn't been a city in Florida that declared itself as a sanctuary city. This is definitely a little bit more of a message bill. Outside of like Florida and New York, you have seen other states kind of beginning to take up some issues. As of this time, you have Oregon potentially getting close to also passing a law that would also grant undocumented immigrants access to driver's licenses. Colorado did the same thing at the end of 2018. So you're starting to see a little bit more push and a little bit more movement in that direction. Aside from SB 168, you haven't seen any real major sort of strong pro-enforcement positions that have been adopted by states. SB 168, I think, really is the key thing there. And this is likely the fact that already a lot of states that would have already legislated on producing pro-enforcement anti-sanctuary provisions have already done that. So, for instance, Texas already did this a couple years ago with SB 4. You have SB 1070 in Arizona, which was mostly struck down by the Supreme Court, kind of set off a whole host of copycat bills after it was passed in 2010. But I think SB 168 kind of is the new kid on the block in this area. But that's largely because I think already a lot of states were already active in this space before.
So you mentioned that report that you wrote last year looking at how national level partisanship has shifted the kinds of laws that states are enacting on immigration. Does the current crop of laws from this year change your conclusions at all in that regard?
No. I think what I'm starting to see a little bit more is with the report, I said that there are kind of two trends that I observed. There are sort of instances where you saw, legislatures that were all Democratic and had Democratic governors, and legislatures that were all Republican had Republican governors, that there was sort of some policy convergence in some policy areas, especially around workforce, making it easier for employers to contract individuals with foreign credentials or immigrants to work in their economies. And this is, I think, largely reflective of really trying to address real needs in their states and also kind of dealing a little bit more with regional variations in what political parties do, reflective of the areas where they live in and sort of the political leanings of that area. But what I also said is that I said that the fact that the immigration debate is filtering down at the state and local level is starting to sort of bring in some of the polarization that we've been seeing at the national level over immigration and really start to influence the type of bills that Democratic and Republican state governments have been passing, particularly with the emergence of, bills that kind of weigh in on the debates around, say, for instance, immigration enforcement, or weighing in on, issues related to DACA. So if anything, what we're seeing, I think, is reinforcing that broader picture of the second conclusion, that partisanship is starting to lead a lot of state legislators to pass bills that really are reflective of if it's a Democratic bill, it's reflective of sort of where Democrats are nationally on immigration, trying to expand benefits. And if it's a Republican bill, really passing stronger, harder edge enforcement bills that align with the national policy priorities of the Republican Party. So I think that's really what we're seeing, is just a reinforcement of that trend. And I think what we're seeing is, I think it's going to be a continuation of that, and that leaves an open question as to whether or not the first trend I observed, sort of this policy convergence, a greater bipartisan consensus on some issues, will continue to exist in the future.
So with that kind of insight, what do you see as being on the horizon for the rest of this year?
So some state legislatures have, wrapped up their legislative sessions. So it's only a few that are going to be active on this. Like I said, Oregon is going to be interesting to see where Oregon is whether or not they manage to get this law passed to grant undocumented immigrants access to driver's licenses. California, oddly enough, as the undisputed leader in passing the most number of state immigration laws, nothing is really kind of caught like the radar in like a lot of these debates or discussions about state immigration laws. The state has already done a lot in this area, but obviously I'd be curious to sort of see what the state's going to be doing there. The other thing, I think, and this just literally just passed, a few days ago as of the date of this recording, was that California also did pass a law and signed into it, which is important, expanding its Medi-Cal program to a broader portion of adults in the state. California has already done this for children a couple of years ago, and that's very much in line with what the state's been doing and kind of really expanding the rights and benefits for undocumented immigrants. And so it's done this now for adults, or for certain adults, I think aged 18 to 25, give or take, expanding with what's already been provided for children. And so, California, it's working year round, and the state may be doing a lot more. It's going to be interesting to sort of see how whatever California does, whether that weighs in on where the Democratic primaries are going. If you remember, during the Democratic debates, there was the question of whether or not undocumented immigrants should receive access to health care in the national health care system, and all the Democratic the contenders on that stage raised their hands. Well, California's already going and doing that in a lot of ways. And so the question is whether or not what California is doing is going to continue sort of politicizing this issue or politicizing other issues on the rights and the benefits that undocumented immigrants should receive. So a lot more I think we'll see what happens with California. And obviously, when the state legislatures get back in session next year, we're going to see where things land. But I think definitely a lot of trends that align with what we've already seen over the last couple of years on partisanship, and really seeing the fact that you're starting to see a lot more divergence with what Republican and Democratic state legislatures are doing on immigration.
All right, we'll leave it there for this episode. Cris, Theresa, thanks for joining me, and thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks as always. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Cris, Ramón, and myself, and produced by Yafat Tawahara. That's all for now. Join us next time on This Week in Immigration.